Hello, it's Brian once again. For those of you that don't know me or haven't been following along, I'll just show that's me. And I am actually going to go and start something kind of what I kind of started last time. That's also on my blog and a picture of me. I can't show a video because my new setup at home, I sit facing opposite a window, so you'll just see a shadow of me anyway. But just checking to make sure that I'm recording. I've got volume. All right, good to go. I think Horvath, he just joined.
Hey,
Hey, how are you doing?
fine, thank you. How are you?
Good. Yep. So yeah, this is the opposite of the actual book review, which we have 2 more weeks of that. I'm actually looking forward to getting doing the next section, talk about enumeration. But for the off weeks, I had mentioned that we're going to start reading some Rails documentation because it's got a lot of basic Ruby in it. And it can kind of, the problem with Rails, a lot of people start in Rails when programming and doing web development, but they don't actually understand a lot of the basic Ruby. So that's the whole purpose of Ruby Newbies. So my idea was to start reading some Ruby libraries, and um, my first library was actually the Inflection library a couple weeks ago, and it turned out it's actually a Rails library. And then I had the idea after doing that, since I accidentally did a Rails library, to go ahead and just continue on doing Rails libraries to kind of demystify what Rails is and how it works. So today we're just going to jump right in and talk about the active model. If you're familiar with Rails, Rails is actually an MVC framework. I think most people know that, and if they don't, and they're new to Rails, now you do. But there's main components of Rails, which you can see all the top sections. There's other components, but I'm just going to talk about these main components that you can see within the Rails GitHub page. So there's active mail or action pack, which I don't know what that does, but maybe we can get into that one day. Action view. Active job, which I think that possibly is a newly announced. I don't remember if active job was actually in Rails prior, but I know there was a big hubbub about it coming out, and I don't know if you could. Oh, just going to look into a previous release and see if it's there. Oop, I don't want to download it. Just want to view it. I don't know if I can view old releases without downloading, but it's downloading. Ooh, that's a big file. I probably don't want to down. Oh, no, it's actually done. Sorry, I'm just stalling for no reason. Yep, looks like, yeah, active job. If you see in my folder, the folder of Rails 4.0, active job is actually not even in the Rails library. So that's actually a new thing that everyone was talking about in the 4.2 beta release, which that's where, let's go ahead and look at that since that's what's available on GitHub. But I don't think I'm going to talk about it because I don't understand it yet. Well, I understand what it does, but I don't think it's necessary to explain it in the future. So yeah, it looks like we got a couple of new ones from the 4.0, but just talking specifically about active model. And so the README, and we're going to jump into some code and try to see if we can play around with some of this and test it out. Try to keep it under 30 minutes and then maybe discuss some stuff later on. But yeah, the README is similar to what's already in the documentation here. So basically, we talked about with the well-grounded Rubyist classes and models. A lot of that's going to be repeated. It's basically the active model is it's built just like classes or models or modules rather. But yeah, let's just read through and see what we get out of it. I didn't do much preparation just because I kind of want to be this more of a. I don't want to just teach. I just kind of want to discover along with the video and anybody participating. So these weeks I'll be learning right alongside everybody else to kind of make it more of an introductory into learning some of these concepts. Plus the fact that I don't have an expertise on any of this yet. So hopefully one day we'll get there. But active model, basic model. Looks like includes interface, action pack. So that's another library. ActiveRecord's another library. ActiveRecord does a lot of the talking for active model between the database. I do want to get into that one week, but if you could see, um, this is all the Rails documentation. This is kind of breaks it down. If we see the terminal, actually, I want to start a new project. Rails new. I'm just creating a new project to see if we can mess around with some stuff. If not, I didn't do preparation, so I might mess up a lot of stuff. And I didn't want to use my own project because I did a lot of new things in my project. I had to revert a lot of changes, so I don't want to do anything like that. But yeah, this looks like so you can call the class person, just like if I just created a dealership. So hopefully I can bundle. Oh, go into dealership and then install those. Migrating database. All right, and then yeah, it just includes active model. So if you were to write, I guess a regular Rails app, I guess if you just want to make a Ruby app, you can just include active model and have access to all that code. But most people will start a Rails app the way I did it, calling Rails new, and then the name of your application. So that's that there. You see that they just created a class and just kind of show you how different things within the active model is available for you. For one thing, persisted is a method. I guess you could set defaults. Oh, so if you wanted to check to see if there were defaults. And you can also obviously set defaults. So if you wanted to have the ID of every person that you created, it could be one. That's pretty straightforward if you have a good grasp of classes. Yeah, and here is this. I didn't really understand calling super if you want attributes hash initialization to happen. So I guess you have to call super within your initialize method if you want to initialize different parameters, I guess, within that object to initialize, which makes sense. I guess it's good to know. This would be like something that maybe down the road, if you get really into nitty-gritty about doing some things like that, something just to remind yourself of, I guess. A lot of times I'll see something in documentation and never use it, but actually go back maybe a month later. I say a lot of times I'm actually not that far into programming and Rails and stuff like that, but I have done this before. I can't think of anything on top of my head, but I know I have referenced stuff that I've seen but never used. So just something to keep in mind. But basically, with an active model, there's only two methods, I guess, that are added. New is something that's already in classes with the initialize, but they explain it up here. And I'm just kind of understanding how this documentation reads for the API for Rails, and then persisted. So I guess they kind of list the methods at the end of the documentation. And one reason I wanted to do this, because the active model documentation is very slim. There's not much hidden in the back end for active model. So I wanted to start with this because it's going to be a quick, easy read for a lot of this stuff. Okay, here's a new method.
Yeah, I was really surprised when I saw the link for it, and it was just like a few line. Okay, not line, but it was quite short.
Yeah. Which it kind of...
I took this a big thing, you know, because it's ActiveRecord. It must be big.
Yeah.
But no.
Yeah, I was surprised myself when I first clicked on the folder and the GitHub page and found that there wasn't too much happening that couldn't be understood. So Obviously, we have attribute accessor. You can say attributes just like any other class. So in Rails, so basically in Rails, it kind of they've added a couple other things to classes, which that's why they call it a model. But that's also everything else. There's other MVC frameworks. So stuff in Rails is not just only seen in Rails. I guess I should say that. This is the only MVC I know very well, though. But some new things that they have, I guess, is a persisted method. And then there's also these other modules that you can include with mod. I know if with models in Rails, validations and conversions are included. So you don't have to actually include validations or conversions because it's actually included automatically for you. So I just wanted to kind of go into these actual modules that come with the model library, and then we'll look at some documentation. We'll actually look at the code in the GitHub once we go to that. And as you can see, so this is the conversion module. So you can do things like toModel, toKey, toParam, which I've seen stuff like toModel. I had an instance where actually when I was working, doing stuff at work, where actually we needed to display, so we had deposits and refunds for the application, and there was a model called deposits. So in order to call the name in the view, they would just called, let me see the terminal. Just if you wanted to call the name, you would just say self dot toModel. You can get an instance of the name. So stuff like that. Sometimes you'll need to like either use names or parse out if it's like a first deposit module and you just need deposit. Well, then you could iterate through that string by getting the model name, and then it comes as a string. So then you could actually convert it to something that you could use. That's the one instance that I've actually used toPath, which I think inventory. I'm just creating a model now. Maybe I'll just make that a little bigger. So I have inventory. Oh, you know what? I think I have to, since I created that, I'll have to break the migrate. Every time you update the database, you'll have to migrate the database. I think it's, I'm not sure if SQL is actually stored locally for you, but I know Postgres is, but we won't get into that. So, inventory.new. Actually, set an object for that. So if I call inventory, all right. So let's say if my inventory wasn't called inventory, but I guess since it already is, we can just see toModel. Okay, so it actually gives you the instance of the model. Actually, toModel doesn't do what I thought it did. So let's actually just read what it does. So first for the key, there's no key attributes. So the keys are actually would be the attribute accessor and stuff like that. So this one actually has no keys, but we're going to look at the model, see what that actually does. Oh, toModel this implementation where simply returns self. Person toModel equals person. Yeah. Okay, it doesn't really do what I thought it did. I guess I must have did like toModel name, but I don't think that's going to work either. Nope, it didn't. Yeah, well, I guess there's a reason to have toModel for some reason, but it just returns an instance of itself. So If you had person equals person.new, person.toModel equals person, and it's true. Seems like a simple to check. But there's, I mean, I guess there's a reason for that to be there. But yeah, it's just good to know, I guess. So yeah, I explained that earlier, completely wrong. But person.create person .toParam suitable for use in URLs or nil if persisted is false. So yeah, this I don't have any anything saved in my model. Actually gives me an error. So let's do this. Oh, that's right, I can't open up. I have to exit. I have to open up Sublime and I'm actually in the console, so that won't work. So I've got an inventory model. I shouldn't have to include this, but maybe I do. No, it's actually included, so I shouldn't have to include that. It should work. But let's have an attribute accessor, and so that way I can create, is that right? Call it type. That might be better. Oh. You know what? This is going to be a little more involved. I think I have to update the table to include the type field. Which actually I didn't want to get into yet. So actually I won't get into adding that attribute accessor because I don't want to go down that rabbit hole of actually creating a full-blown model and update the table. But I think maybe a good one next to look at is actually ActiveRecord to see how that works. Because actually I don't know how that works completely. But we'll just move on. So I don't know why the params is coming back 1. Maybe because, yeah, it doesn't really explain. Maybe we just look in the code. To partial path return string. Action pack uses this to find a suitable partial to represent the object. So if you know about partials, I guess that's how that works. And that's how action pack finds that. So this a couple like simple methods. It's just like the inflector that we looked at 2 weeks ago. It's just some simple stuff just to give back some simple information. That's it. There's only 3 methods in there. Not sure what this one is. Maybe there's only one instance of that. No, only one parameter. But when I did ID is nil, created that, updated that. So it looked like in my, it's been a while since I actually created a new Rails app. But it looks like it created, I think an ID is actually comes out of the box. Because I have no instance of IDs in my table. I'm sorry if I'm getting a little confusing. I'm actually confused myself. But ID actually, all these three instances from the table of that model, they actually come with the model. So maybe we can look at the Rails code to find out how that started and kind of remove that mystery. If not, then it might be a mystery. But so that's the conversion. I mean, there's some simple things happening. I've thought I used this one, but actually used maybe something similar that was maybe built in the app. That's the other problem. Coming into an application down the road, there's a lot of methods and stuff like that that are actually in the system that I don't know the definitions of, but they're called from other places. So I still don't have a good grasp of the actual application I work on day to day. But one day I will. So that's conversion. There's only one more to look at before we jump into code, which is validations. In validations, a lot of if you go into our tutorial, you'll see like the validates presence of name. This is basically how that works. So if we look at active model validations, it includes, which this is included in the model, so you don't have to explicitly call it on your model. But that's what I was trying to do, the attribute accessor, and this will validate each. So it takes the record, which will be first name or last name. Oh no, actually the record, it must be something else. Oh, the record must be the instance of that. No, it must be first name or last name, and then the attribute and the value. So if that's nil, well, let's look at this. Record.errors, .add. Oh, so the record must be in the database, and the attribute is your first name, and that's the value of what is there. So if the value is nil, value.2s, well, we're not validating the presence. We're actually validating if it starts with z. There we go. That makes sense. So here's the record attribute, and this is, if it starts with z, then it is not valid. It looks like it's actually adding errors, so it doesn't want it to start with z, which I think we see here. Person.new is valid, and if it's invalid, it's false. But if we change the first name to Zoolander, which starts with a z, there we go. It actually will be false. So it's actually checking that it starts with z, then it won't be valid. So everything else is valid, which is I guess they wanted to show the example. Yeah. It adds errors. So basically with validations, it'll add an error to the record. Okay, that makes sense. It adds an error to the record, so that way it checks if there's any errors. And if there's an error, then it will actually throw it as invalid. And these are some methods. Valid and invalid are some things I use in testing. Some methods that come out of the box. With testing, it's all just like a model. You can actually use the same methods from the inventory model, or what is it, a person model. So all those methods are available to you, just like valid and invalid. Invalidates the presence of true. Yeah, that looks pretty straightforward. So this is actually validating if it's nil or if it's there. So why? Huh. So it's invalid if it's new. Person.invalid. It's false. Yep. I guess we don't have to nitpick on every single one of these methods. We can just see that there's a valid method. There's a validates with method. But I did want to show, I had the issue of actually, I needed to, actually it's the JavaScript. I had to validate multiple email addresses, which there was not an actual email validator for a series of emails and strings. So I spent a good couple hours trying to figure it out, which I think my implementation is here. So I actually created something similar that actually comes out of the box, but I had to take a string of emails. So if you think of like if you had an input box and you had an email and you had a multiple emails, you just separated by commas. So I had to actually create a method that validates emails format. So I'm checking self, which we learned from well-grounded Ruby is self.email. Self is actually, it will call the instance of that class or model. So, and I had an attribute emails. That was the input field. So it actually iterates from each email, and if it checks each email. Okay, it's actually doing a check unless is here, so it actually checks from devise, which is a whole nother library, or actually a Ruby gem. They have a method that has an actual regex for emails, and it will match. It's matching each one of these emails to see if it matches that, and if it doesn't, it will add an error. Email is not valid to that email. So that's kind of how that works, which kind of helped me understand how this worked. So how errors work with models. It would actually add an actual error or an error message to that model. So I thought that was good to know and cool to learn. I learned that a couple weeks ago. So, but these methods actually will help you if you need to write a separate method like I did. I lost it already. Say if you need to write an actual validation specifically for what you're looking for. So if you need to validate, I'm all over the place. If you need to validate if something started with the letter Z, then just note that you're able to do that. So that's it as far as the modules that I included with there. There's some other, yeah, we won't get into that. That's a little callbacks and class method and helper method. It's a little more deeper than I thought I wanted to go. But let's just poke around through the documentation, which the documentation is a lot similar to what we just read on the README, but it looks like it goes in a little more detail. Adding errors to interfaces, initialize at errors. So kind of like that method was kind of similar to the way my method was written, except I had multiple emails. But that's how out of the box how errors are added. In a nutshell, basically. So this one's the basic validate if the name is blank or if the presence is nil. Serialization, something I just learned about a couple weeks ago, but if you wanted to make it similar to like JSON or XML, or if you wanted to, like, for my example, I had to send emails in a JSON format to the email.js file that I had. But by serializing it, I was able to just put everything into a serial, I guess, is that the object, or a JSON object, and send it to the AJAX function to perform AJAX on my model, or my modal, which sounds like a lot, but it actually, once I figured out how to do it, I think it took me about a half an hour to figure it out on my own. But when I had to do it again, it took me 10 minutes. So it's pretty simple once you figure it out, which is pretty cool. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Custom validations. It's kind of what I did. It's good to note that you have to include active model validations. So if you aren't using a Rails model and you want to use validations similar to that, you'll have to include it, which I actually had to do there was a Virtus gem that we won't have to get into, but I had to include it for another thing I was working on. But the active model, so that's weird. So it looks like the active model actually has its own lib folder, which in Rails, oh, it doesn't. So Rails doesn't have a lib folder in the project. This one does. So it's almost like ActiveRecord, Active Model, and Active Mail, and all these other. They'll have their own test files in libraries, which is good to know. Well, I'm not sure if that's helpful, but I guess each section's actually I've seen that guy on Twitter. Each section's actually its own little project, if you kind of think of that. Maybe kind of like that, but I don't know. I might be wrong. But yeah. Actually, I did a lot of poking around. Yeah, at this point, Horvath, if you have any questions, we can go different ways and tangents, which is fine. But
no, everything's fine.
Yeah, figured it's like kind of.
It's not that hard. It's kind of logical. I don't know how to say it.
Yeah.
So yeah, and It's funny to see that how many things going under the hood because you just don't see it in a Rails app. It's just there.
No, yeah, because Rails, I mean, like I showed you, I could just call Rails new, whatever. It populates my Rails app. If I wanted to create a model, I hit Rails G model. A lot of stuff happening in the background, little
Yeah,
helpers for you, which is pretty cool. And then all the stuff is like included too out of the box. So it's like it takes out all the guesswork because I guess if you were to start a Sinatra app, you'd have to add. Well, I don't really know everything about Sinatra, so I don't want to speak out of place, but I know there's a lot of stuff that Rails has that Sinatra doesn't. And I know a lot of
yeah,
people, if you get to a point where you're building an application that's outside the scope of your small little project, or it gets to the point where you're adding controllers and you're adding, I don't know if Sinatra has validations, but I don't think it does. But you're adding stuff like that, then you're at the point where you might as well just start with Rails.
yeah.
Um,
I'm planning to get into Sinatra, and because of this, because you have to build your own web app, and
yeah.
not like in Rails that you have everything, you just have to use it, but you have to build every component of the web app. So I might get a bigger picture of how web application works.
Yeah, and yeah,
Uh,
Sinatra's actually. So I was actually listening to a podcast, I think, actually the Ruby Rogues, and they were mentioning that Pardrino, I think it's called, is kind of like the step between Sinatra and Rails,
mhm.
and what they're doing a lot in the boot camp. So actually start people off with Sinatra because it's the most basic, out of the box Ruby framework you can get, and you can learn a lot of the basics and a lot of the stuff that confuses people with Rails. You don't have to approach yet, and then people can then move on to Pardrino, which has a lot of the stuff that Sinatra doesn't, and then eventually you can go to Rails. So you kind of get the understanding of like how things work, like just like looking at validations. It might
Mhm.
be a mystery to a lot of people, but a lot of people
Yeah,
just will
yeah,
just
yeah.
write validates and or validates the presence of whatever that line was, validates the presence of name, and that's all they do, and that's all they need to know. So some people might not need to know like how it works and how to build their own, but knowing Sinatra kind of helps break it down, and it actually will help. Even it'll probably be a lot easier than just reading Rails documentation, but by
Mhm.
jumping in and actually building your own controller or building your own um, similar to ActiveRecord, talking to the database. Again, I've only used Sinatra on one or two practice applications or little projects, very small things. Um, but I didn't really pursue it after that. Once jumping into Rails.
Could you
Uh,
share a link for that podcast?
yeah, yeah. Let me. I think it was the most latest one. Yep. Yeah, it'll be the episode 170, which I'll just throw in the that page. Yeah, it's a very good podcast. Lately they've had a lot over the summer. They had a lot more beginner topics.
Mhm.
Um, But when I first started listening to him, it was kind of more heavier towards the more experienced stuff. But they've been doing a good job going back and forth to more basic stuff and then jumping over the advanced things. So it's good. It's a nice little introduction to Ruby as a whole because you get exposed to a lot of topics that you might never have heard of, like Pardrino. I've heard of the name, but never actually looked into it. So I had an opportunity to actually, Google search it and understand a little more about it. But where were we? Oh, this active job. But yeah, looking at the active model folder, which now I'm finding out it's a little separate, kind of like a smaller separate project. You can see like all these files. Looks like all these are these are all modules with different methods. Yeah, format validator. Not sure what that does. Um, oh yeah, I'm in the error validations. That's right. So yeah, um, like if you ever had an issue like what I had where I had to build my own validations and you needed to know how like the validations worked like I did, I was easily able just to look into the documentation, see. I didn't have to go this deep because obviously there's a section for custom validations, I thought I saw. And there's also Stack Overflow is very helpful for stuff like that when you have to build your own things. Um, but yeah, you could just tell that there's no magic happening. It's all written in Ruby code, which makes it a lot easier. So we went to like the Ruby libraries. Most of those are actually written in Ruby code also, but when you get to actually the Ruby core, a lot of it's written in some C. So it kind of makes it a little confusing to try to wrap your brain around. But yeah, other than that, yeah, there was just looking at some validations. But yeah, just one this method after validation takes an argument and takes a block, and that's all you really need to know. Run out validations, so you can see that the code is like it's very approachable to me. Like I understand what's going on. If I spend enough time reading this, it's weird. Then I would have a better understanding of Rails as a whole. But honestly, it's not really, like actually sitting down and reading the documentation is not 100% necessary, but it does help to know what you're working with, what you're dealing with, and understand how the code works. It's weird that they have cut, and I guess is that paste? Cut and nail care. It's interesting. And what's even cooler is that you can actually see, so Zizak, who actually you can find on Twitter. Actually, I follow him, I think. I'm very active on Twitter. You can actually see all the people who have contributed to this one file. This listed right here, which is pretty awesome. And it's like this is serialization, and like within the documentation, they have notes a lot of times. Actually, Rails, when you first start Rails, you'll actually see that a lot of the code, like in the routes file, actually comes with documentation similar to how to use it, which is pretty nice. I did it most of the time on this. Honestly, I don't think I've even read all this before, but if you ever start a new project, I highly recommend reading through it before, actually, because it, like namespacing is a good thing to know, because a lot of times people will have a controller that will be like at products, at inventory, slash cars, slash Mustang, and you'll just start stringing more and more routes over and over again, or nesting them. But namespacing will help you to, instead of doing all that, you could just do at Mustang slash admin slash Mustang. So it makes it so your browser isn't strong like this. I mean, it would be pretty crazy if this just went on and on and on. Yeah. But yeah, serialization, that's another cool thing to look into. I've just had the opportunity to use it last week, and it seems like something I could probably use in the future, since I have a lot of files that talk back and forth to JavaScript files, and we have no JavaScript framework in play at my current employer, so we do a lot of JSON talking. I'm not sure if there's a better way to do that, and I'm not even sure. I don't really understand everything about the way we talk to our JavaScript files, but I know with data, with the front end of our app, it doesn't always talk well to the back end of the app. So yeah, it's all good stuff to look into. I mean, just note, so in the actual API documentation, only mentioned validations and conversions, but yeah, there's tons of other stuff that's also working in the background to make that work. I think I just looked into serializers. Naming, include root. So ID name. Oh, that's cool. JSON. Yeah, and I think just recently I had to look into the Twitter gem, and what I found the easiest thing to do is what I was specifically trying to do, all I did was actually search the file, which I don't know if you know this, Horvath. Actually, what IDE do you use? Do you use Sublime? With Sublime, I'm not sure if a lot of people knew this. I didn't know this until I started working. Actually, I interviewed for this job. If you hit Command T, you can actually search throughout your project just by typing in words, and even like inventory, or if you want to do inventory tests, you can do inventory test, and it will show up. You don't have to do full complete words. But in GitHub, oops, it's the same thing. If you just hit, instead of Command T, if you hit T, you can actually search through the entire Rails project. So if I wanted to look at active controller, except you can't do fuzzy searches. I think you have to do. Actually, I think it's.
Unfortunately, it's Sublime Text. Yeah, I'm using Linux, so it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Command. We don't have command, but it doesn't work with T. Do you know maybe if which menu have this search, so I can check the short
I don't know
keys?
off the top of my head, but I know a lot of different IDEs. They actually do have some shortcuts, some pretty cool shortcuts. I do know like Vim and Emacs. They have the whole language of operating with their interface. So their shortcuts are completely vague to me.
Sorry, I didn't say Emacs. I said Linux.
Oh, Linux. Okay.
So on my key, I don't have the command key. I have Control.
Okay.
And it doesn't work with Control. I'm using Sublime Text like you.
Okay. Maybe it's Alt if you have a Windows
Alt.
keyboard.
Okay. No, unfortunately
No.
not.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, you might be able to search it.
It's a really cool feature. I didn't know about this. I'm gonna definitely check out.
Yeah, I'm sure there's something similar for Windows.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work with GitHub.
Oh, it doesn't?
So no Control. No, I tried Control T.
Just try T by itself.
Yeah, with T it works. It works. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, on GitHub. Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, that was I got looking at the Rails project. It's like obviously it's a lot of folders and files, but to be able just to hit T, that was something I had no idea that you could do, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah. It's a cool feature. Gonna find it.
Cool. Well, I think active model. I mean, there's not really anything crazy happening. Actually, let's look at the test file. Because the best, wow, one test. Wow, that would have helped a lot if I knew this. I should have looked at the test here. But anyway, I'm just talking to myself. The test files actually are a great way to learn applications by reading test, because it's basically describing on how it's supposed to work. And condition is true. Wow. For such a, what is it, sheep? Oh. Deletes trailing white spaces. That's very interesting. I would like to know if this is actually used, the sheep class. Yeah, it looks like this is sort of setting up the test. Their test suite. Oh, well, they use, I wonder, or maybe the test actually, this is actually setting, I don't see any assertions. Oh, here we go. So I guess that was their version of factories. Maybe I was just looking at, but here are some basic tests. Cert and callbacks work. Yeah. But yeah, this I think this is probably something this will be a work in progress as far as reading Rails documentation. It's not exciting at all to read Rails documentation or any documentation, but just by skimming it, it kind of gives you an idea of what's going on. And if I ever wanted to know how to write a test for callbacks, I guess now I know. is there a setup here? Okay, so callbacks before create. Sure. I guess it will take a lot of like messing around with stuff, but that would obviously be a lot longer video. So speaking of which, we've gone past the 30 minutes. So yeah, that's I'll end the video for now. I think I might spend a little more time going through some of this documentation, but I highly encourage if anybody has any questions or has any things they would like to point out as far as the active model, feel free to leave a comment or a message. But yeah, this is something that I haven't had a chance to do, and again, it's not super exciting, but it's definitely interesting. So yeah, I'll just end it at that.